Hello YouTube! In this video I'm going to outline a type of skeptical argument known as a global debunking argument. A global debunking argument involves giving an account of how our beliefs originated in a way that supplies a defeater for all our beliefs. So, just to elaborate on the terminology here, we'll say that a defeater for a belief is a reason that shows that the belief is not justified. A defeater removes the justification for the belief. For example, suppose I read an ethnography about a tribe from a well-regarded anthropologist, and on this basis I form various beliefs about the tribe. Maybe I come to believe that all men in the tribe wear purple headdresses, because this is what was written in the book. But then I discover that the book is a fabrication. The anthropologist never visited the tribe in question. This gives me a defeater for my belief. My belief that the men of the tribe wear purple headdresses was based on what was written in the ethnography, but the ethnography was just made up by the anthropologist, so I no longer have a good reason to hold that belief. Now, notice that the fact that the anthropologist never visited the tribe is not in itself evidence that the men in the tribe do not wear purple headdresses. I mean, maybe they do, right? But the point is that the fact that the anthropologist never visited the tribe removes my reason for believing that the men in the tribe wear purple headdresses. The anthropologist's testimony can no longer be treated as a reliable indicator of what goes on in the tribe. So the important point is that I can undermine the justification for a belief even if I don't have direct evidence that the belief is actually false. Skeptical arguments in general aim to provide global defeaters, right? They aim to undermine the justification for all our beliefs. Global debunking arguments are one type of skeptical argument. They target the source of our beliefs. They try to show that the source of our beliefs cannot be shown to be reliable. So, okay. What exactly are debunking arguments in general? Well, a debunking argument is going to proceed by giving you a story about how some set of beliefs arose, or how the source of some set of beliefs arose. And then it tries to show that this story undermines the justification for those beliefs. The general structure of a debunking argument can be stated like this. This formulation comes from Kahane. So, premise 1, S's belief that P is explained by X. Premise 2, X is an off-track process. So that is, X does not track the truth, it is not responsive to the truth. So, S's belief that P is unjustified. The ethnography does not track the truth with respect to the tribe. That the book is off-track because its content is not based on what happens in the real-world tribe, rather its content comes from whatever the anthropologist came up with. So, a debunking argument is going to aim to undermine our justification for certain beliefs by showing that those beliefs have been produced by processes that fail to track the truth. One way to think of this is that the truth of P plays no role in our explanation of why people formed the belief that P. Given that my beliefs about the tribe are based on a falsified ethnography, I mean, obviously I would believe that the men in the tribe wear purple headdresses regardless of what those men actually wear. Now, there is an important qualification to this way of stating the debunking argument. We can always give a causal explanation for any belief, and this explanation can always cite processes that are not truth-tracking. In fact, any causal explanation is probably going to cite some processes that are not truth-tracking. So one of the things that Kahane notes is that there are many causal factors involved in explaining, any belief, right? Like, suppose we want to explain why Einstein developed the theory of relativity. Well, in order for Einstein to form the theory of relativity, he had to choose to study physics. He required enough food and resources to survive. He needed access to books. He had to learn a language and so on. Most of these causal factors that led Einstein to propose the theory of relativity had nothing to do with the theory itself. So with this point in mind, a debunking argument doesn't just cite, it doesn't just sort of say, well, this played a role in producing the belief and this is not truth tracking. Rather, the story about how the belief arose must leave no room for truth tracking processes. And again, that's what we find with the example of the fictional ethnography. If my justification for my beliefs about the tribe is just what is written in that ethnography, and then the ethnography is discovered to be an invention, there's no room for that to be truth tracking. Okay then, a quick advert. If you like my channel, you can support me on Patreon, where I upload bonus videos, further thoughts on the topics that I talk about, or you can send a one-off donation on PayPal. I offer private tutoring in philosophy. Send an email if you're interested, and join the Discord. The link for all of this will be in the description. Right. Perhaps the most famous type of debunking argument is the evolutionary debunking argument. Now, evolutionary debunking is evolutionary debunking arguments have cropped up in lots of different areas of philosophy. It's particularly popular in metaethics. Moral anti-realists have argued that moral beliefs are a product of natural selection, but that selection cannot is not responsive to the moral facts. So, you know, this debunks our moral beliefs. I have a whole video on debunking arguments in metaethics specifically, which I will link in the comments. A global evolutionary debunking argument attacks the reliability of belief-forming mechanisms in general. So it's going to attack all of our beliefs. Diego Machuca, in the article Global Evolutionary Debunking Arguments, gives the debunking argument as follows. So premise 1, our belief-forming processes have been shaped by evolution through natural selection. Premise 2, so our belief-forming processes have been selected to promote survival and reproduction. Premise 3, false beliefs can be as advantageous for survival and reproduction as true beliefs. 4, so natural selection is not truth tracking, so we are unjustified in believing that our belief-forming processes are reliable. And if we're not justified in believing that our belief-forming processes are reliable, we seem to have a defeater for all our beliefs. So if we take the proposition, our belief-forming processes are reliable, the claim is not that this proposition is false, but that given the evolutionary history of our belief-forming processes, there's just no reason to accept this proposition. It may have been that we were selected to have belief-forming processes that tended to produce false beliefs. If so, there would be no room for our belief-forming processes to be truth-tracking. So this is one way of stating the argument. Now, there's a slightly different version of this argument that's been quite influential in philosophy, and this has been presented by Alvin Plantinga as an objection to naturalism specifically. Now, by naturalism, Plantinga basically just means the view that there is no God or anything like God, right? There's no supreme creator or creators, nothing supernatural. The world consists of nothing more than what is postulated by our best sciences. Plantinga presents the argument as follows. So, first of all, N here is naturalism, the view that there is no God. E is the claim that human cognitive faculties are produced by natural selection, so it's, you know, the evolutionary story. And then R is the view that our cognitive faculties are reliable. Okay, so Plantinga's argument goes like this. First of all, there is the probability thesis, which says that the probability of R given N and E, so the probability that our cognitive faculties are reliable given naturalism and the fact that we are products of evolution, that is either low or it's inscrutable, right? Or like we just can't determine the probability, right? But the probability is not going to be high. Then there's the defeater thesis, which is that if you accept N and E and the probability thesis, you have a defeater for R. And then finally, there's the claim that if you have a defeater for R, you have a defeater for all your beliefs. You have a reason to doubt all your beliefs. Now, obviously, pretty much all naturalists will want to accept modern evolutionary theory, so naturalism leads to global skepticism. Now, regardless of how exactly the evolutionary debunking argument is stated, The crucial claim that's being made is that there's no reason to expect that evolution will select for cognitive processes that tend to produce true beliefs. Natural selection is sensitive ultimately to behavior, right? So it will select for whatever behavioral tendencies lead the organism to survive and reproduce. I mean, it doesn't, intrinsically, it doesn't really matter what's going on in your head. As long as you survive and reproduce, then, like, you're going to be selected for. So whatever happens in your head that helps you survive and reproduce, that's going to be selected for. Now, you might think that the prospects for a skeptical argument here are quite poor because, look, I mean, you might think, okay, in general, true beliefs about the world are actually likely to be useful. They're likely to promote survival and reproduction. Or at least there are many contexts where true belief is going to promote survival and reproduction. It's surely beneficial to have an accurate representation of your environment. Let's say, for instance, that there's a pride of lions in the clearing ahead. Well, clearly it would promote my survival and reproduction if I accurately detect those lions. Detecting a threat is going to be useful because that allows me to, execute some strategy of retreat or avoidance or whatever. Even more useful would be to detect the exact nature of the threat. So if I detect that, the threat is a predator, if I detect how many predators there are, if I detect in what direction the predators are moving and so on, the more information I have, the more that will support more complex strategies to avoid the threat. So if you think about it like that, I would expect that natural selection will generate reliable perceptual faculties, at least with respect to mid-sized objects in my immediate environment, the sorts of objects that I'm able to, interact with and avoid and so on. Maybe there's not really much hope for skepticism here. However, there are some issues with this kind of view. So, first of all, we know that there are plenty of cases where survival and reproduction is promoted by false beliefs or by misrepresentation. Suppose, for instance, that an organism has some sort of threat detection mechanism. Well, we would expect that this is going to favour false positives over more accurate representations. The reason for this is that even the most accurate mechanism is occasionally going to go wrong, right? Nothing is perfect. You're not going to get any sort of cognitive system that gives you perfect accuracy. So, yeah, okay, the question is, like, do we take is perfect accuracy going to be sort of the ideal? Like, is selection going to favor more accuracy, or might it sometimes favor actually less accuracy? And sometimes it's going to favor less accuracy. So because even the most accurate mechanism will occasionally go wrong, the problem is that when it comes to detecting threats, it only takes one false negative. If you think that there's no threat when there actually is, you're out the gene pool, right? Like, that's it. Or that's all it takes is one mistake to end your life. On the other hand, there's relatively little cost to false positives. If you think that there is a threat when there isn't, I mean, okay, maybe you're going to be scared, maybe you run away, whatever, but there's not much cost to that. So selection is going to favour threat detection mechanisms that are highly biased towards false positives. That's one example of how there may well be systematic misrepresentation, right? So this is just one example of how a selection process may favour a kind of systematic misrepresentation. Again, that's only one example, but it's illustrative, right? Falsehoods can be useful. A good analogy here is to think of the user interface on a computer desktop. This example comes from Dan Dennett. So when you operate your computer, you use a pointer to manipulate various icons. There's the folders, the files, the windows, the menus. You click on a file and drag it from one folder into another folder. This type of interface allows you to control the computer easily, but it is completely misleading in terms of what's happening in the operating system and the hardware. So, like, you make a folder on the desktop, But beyond the desktop interface, nothing really has the properties that the folder seems to have. Indeed, there isn't really a folder at all. Within the computer, there are no folders or windows or menus. What occurs on the desktop is a user illusion. It's a highly simplified, idealized image of underlying processes that are extremely complex, and the point of this is to make it easier for us to operate the machine. So what we have in the case of the user interface of a desktop is, like, one way to look at this is it's a false representation that is nevertheless extremely useful. Maybe our cognitive faculties have been selected to generate a kind of user illusion of the world. When I see a lion and then run away from it, this might be analogous to moving a file from one folder to another. In both cases, I'm working within this illusory model. The actual processes that are going on behind the scenes, as it were, are very, very different. So yeah, I mean, this is one point, right? Falsehoods can be useful. There's another issue with the assumption that selection will favor true beliefs, which is that behavior is a product of both beliefs and desires, right? And ultimately, all that matters when it comes to selection is behavior. It's what you do. It's how you act. Now, when an organism comes across a lion, the organism needs internal states that are going to motivate it to run away from the lion. Okay, if there are really lions and an organism is one of the lions is potentially going to be its prey, well, yeah, the organism is going to be selected to have internal states that motivate it to run away from the lion. But consider this scenario. So Plantinga suggests, well, suppose that Delia desires to be eaten by a lion, but incorrectly believes that the best way to get eaten by lions is to avoid lions and to run away from lions, and so on. Or suppose that Delia incorrectly believes that the lion in question that she sees is not going to eat her, so she runs away in search of other lions, or whatever. These combinations of beliefs and desires will get Delia away from the lion. Now, this is obviously a toy example, but the point is that for any behavior at all, there's going to be a variety of pairs of beliefs and desires that would produce that behavior. So organisms could evolve with highly unreliable belief-forming mechanisms, provided their desires are appropriately tuned to produce adaptive behavior, right? Like, as long as you sort of, like, you can give an organism almost any beliefs at all, as long as you sort of tune the desires in the right way, you're going to get the desired the required behavior, the behavior that promotes survival and reproduction. So, if all of this is right, then the argument will go that there is no reason to think that selection is going to favour cognitive faculties that tend to produce true beliefs. Indeed, the argument will be that it would be something of a miraculous coincidence if selection favoured such faculties, if selection produced reliable faculties. So this provides me with a defeater for all my beliefs. I can no longer trust the reliability of the sources of my beliefs, and so I can no longer trust those beliefs. Okay, so that is a global debunking argument. We have a story about how beliefs are produced, and then we have the argument that given this story, our beliefs are just unreliable. How might we respond to this? Well, one type of strategy is to argue that, I don't believe only that our cognitive faculties evolved through natural selection. I have a variety of other beliefs as well, and some of these other beliefs may raise the probability that our cognitive faculties are reliable. So we can grant that the probability that our faculties are reliable, given naturalism and the evolutionary story, right? We can grant that this probability is low, but there may be some other proposition X such that the probability of R given N and E and X is high. So just to illustrate this, suppose, for instance, that we were to take X to be R itself. Well, obviously, even if the probability of R given N and E is extremely low, the probability of R given N and E and R that's just one, right? That's as high as you can get. So, or maybe I believe a proposition such as we have won the evolutionary lottery. So yes, evolution doesn't select for reliable faculties, but we just happen to get lucky. Again, that's going to make it very probable that our faculties are reliable. Now, I mean, obviously, appealing to these sorts of background beliefs is just question begging in this context, or it seems to be anyway. But there are more sophisticated ways of arguing here. So one thing we might say is, well, look, it's an assumption of methodological naturalism, at least, that we can't determine from the armchair how the world works. We have to go out into the world, do experiments, make observations. So we can't figure out from the armchair whether evolution is the kind of process that selects for true beliefs. Yes, I mean, there are these suggestive analogies like the analogy to the desktop interface, but that's all they are, analogies. If we want to know what sorts of things evolution tends to make, we need to study the things that it has actually made. And when we do this, we can observe that most organisms have reliable faculties, at least in a wide range of environments. Most of the organisms that we look at do in fact accurately perceive the world around them, at least, broadly speaking. That gives us evidence that evolution selects for reliable faculties. Also, consider that we now have fairly sophisticated models of how our own cognitive faculties actually work. So I don't believe merely that my belief-forming processes were produced by natural selection. I also have beliefs about how those belief-forming processes function. I mean, think about visual perception. Our best model of visual perception involves, it's like, okay, there's going to be light interacting with objects in the world. The light enters our eyes, it stimulates the rods and cones in the retina. These send signals down the optic nerve into the visual cortex, etc. That's a simplified model. Obviously, each of these steps can now be understood in much greater detail, but it follows from our best scientific model of visual perception that visual perception is not wholly unreliable. Yes, there are plenty of visual illusions. There are many ways in which visual perception idealizes and simplifies, but it also tracks genuine regularities in the world. So the probability of R given N and E is low, but we have to consider all of the evidence. If we take X to be the scientific models of faculties like visual perception, then the probability of R given N and E and X is high. So that's one sort of move, right? Is we can try to appeal to these like other propositions that we believe that will then raise the probability of R. Another response along similar lines is that non-propositional evidence can make it rational to believe a proposition, even if that proposition is improbable, given the other propositions you accept. So this is the line taken by Michael Bergmann in his article Commonsense Naturalism. Bergmann proposes the following analogy. Suppose I have a set of straws of different lengths. I then draw 5 straws at random. I see that each of these straws is 3 inches long, or it visually appears 3 inches long. Each straw visually appears 3 inches long. Now, the process by which I chose these straws does not select for 3-inch long straws. The probability that I will end up with 5 3-inch long straws, given that the straws are drawn from a set of varying lengths by random lottery, that probability is obviously very low. But that does nothing to defeat my belief that I did indeed choose 5 3-inch long straws. So, the proposition I selected 5 3-inch long straws, that's improbable. But I should still believe it because I can just see that the straws are all 3 inches long. Bergmann's point is that some beliefs are justified directly by our experiences, not by other beliefs. My visual impression of the straws is an example of this kind of direct experiential evidence. The evidence from sense perception outweighs the evidence that's given by the probabilistic inference. So the question is there evidence for R that outweighs the probabilistic evidence against it? Well, Bergmann says yes. He says that there is non-propositional evidence for R. And he draws on an idea from Thomas Reid. So there are some general principles that we know by a kind of intuition. Reid's idea is that when we consider some claims, we experience what he calls an emotion of ridicule. The claim strikes us as absurd. So take a claim like 1 plus 1 equals 3, or causes can precede their effects. We don't need to make any observations to see that there's something wrong with claims like these. Merely attempting to conceive of these claims prompts a feeling of ridicule, and on this basis we reject those claims. By contrast, 1 plus 1 equals 2 and causes follow their effects, they seem perfectly sensible. So we have this emotion of ridicule that accompanies some propositions, and on this basis we reject those propositions. And we use this to determine, the basic logical and mathematical axioms that we accept, or we use it to determine what fundamental metaphysical principles to accept. So let's suppose then that the probability of R given N and E is indeed low. Nevertheless, I have non-propositional evidence for R, because when I consider the possibility of not R, when I consider the idea that our cognitive faculties are unreliable, I experience an emotion of ridicule. Not R strikes us as absurd, and this justifies us in accepting R. So the non-propositional evidence for R outweighs the probabilistic evidence against R. That's Bergmann's idea. Okay, obviously there's many things that might be said about these responses. I just want to note a kind of general problem for both of these for previous responses. A general problem which is going to crop up for many of the attempted responses to this argument. So the first response we saw attempts to use observation and science to secure a high probability that our faculties are reliable. So yes, the evolutionary history debunks this, but the direct models of other creatures and ourselves shows that our faculties are reliable. The second response appeals to particular kind of experiences. So it's absurd to doubt our reliability. Our reliability is self-evident. The problem is that the debunker will say, look, once we grant the evolutionary story, well, we now have reason to doubt the very faculties that we are using to generate the evidence for our reliability. So I observe the kinds of creatures produced by evolution. I see a connection between their cognitive faculties and the environment. But maybe this is merely an idealization of the actual situation. The evolutionary debunking argument casts doubt on whether I can trust observation. The suggestion is it's going to be question-begging in response to this to assume that observation is reliable. So the situation is like this. I start out by trusting observation. I assume that my perceptual faculties are mostly reliable. On this basis, I form various beliefs about the world, including beliefs about how those perceptual faculties work, and beliefs about how those perceptual faculties arose. Then I find that the story about how those perceptual faculties arose casts doubt on their reliability. Well, I can't now restore my confidence in their reliability by appealing to my beliefs about how those faculties work, because the beliefs about how those faculties work, those beliefs are themselves based on those faculties. So I have cast doubt on the source of a belief. I then attempt to restore my confidence in this source by appealing to beliefs that are produced by this source, by appealing to the testimony of this source. That does seem problematically circular. At least if you are in a state where you're doubting the source of a belief, it's not clear how you're going to restore your confidence in that source by appealing to beliefs that are based on that source. Andrew Moon, responding to Bergmann's argument, proposes the tricky straws case. Suppose, again, that I have many straws of different lengths and I draw 5 at random. It visually appears to me that all 5 are 3 inches long. But now suppose that I'm told that these straws are tricky straws purchased from a local magic shop. Tricky straws look longer or shorter than they really are. Well, in this case, my experiences do not outweigh the probabilistic evidence that all the straws are not 3 inches long. So in Bergmann's original straws case, um, I, I sort of, I have like this probabilistic inference, which which kind of leads me to doubt that all the straws are 3 inches long. But then I look at the straws and I have visual evidence that they're 3 inches long. And the visual evidence is not called into question. The visual evidence stands, right? So I can trust that, and I can believe that the straws are all 3 inches long. In the tricky straws case, it's quite clear that the story about the origin of the straws calls into question my visual evidence. So the visual evidence no longer outweighs the probabilistic evidence. And the evolutionary debunker is going to argue that the evolutionary case is more like this tricky straw case. Given the evolutionary history of our cognitive faculties, we have probabilistic evidence that our faculties are unreliable. Then we try to restore confidence in those faculties, maybe by appealing to scientific models or by appealing to experiences like Reid's emotions of ridicule. But the problem is that this evidence is called into question by the evolutionary story. And of course, the problem here is that the evolutionary debunking argument is totally general. It targets all of our cognitive faculties. So if the point that has just been outlined is right, if this skeptical response is right, then it looks like no objection along the lines of the two that we have seen is going to be viable. Both of the responses that we've seen involve starting from a position of trust in at least some of our faculties. So the faculties that we use to justify some proposition X, or the faculties that deliver the non-propositional evidence. But the evolutionary history of those faculties has already cast doubt upon them, and so the skeptic will say, well, it's just like, of course we can't use those faculties to restore our confidence in our reliability. And that's going to be sort of perfectly general. No response along these lines is going to work, the skeptic will say. Okay then, let's think about a different type of response then. Well, another response is that global debunking arguments are self-defeating. And it's fairly easy to see why, right? The debunker needs to assert some story, some explanatory story about how our belief-forming processes were formed. But if we have a defeater for all our beliefs, then we also have a defeater for our belief in that story. A global debunking argument would then be self-defeating, because by coming to believe the conclusion of the global debunking argument, you undermine your justification for accepting the premises. But that's just to say that there's no longer any justification for accepting the conclusion. So we have to presume that some of our beliefs are true, that reason is reliable, in order to construct and endorse a global debunking argument. In which case, the argument can't provide a global debunking. Right? Global debunking arguments can't possibly work because they require us to believe a story about how our beliefs arose, but then they provide a defeater for all our beliefs, and so that defeats our belief in that story. So Andrew Moon, in his article Global Debunking Arguments, suggests a response on behalf of the debunker that appeals to the XX pill case, which comes from Alvin Plantinga. So Plantinga proposes this scenario. You learn that a pill called XX destroys the cognitive reliability of 95% of those who ingest it. You take the pill and come to believe both that I have ingested XX and that the probability that my faculties are reliable, given that I've ingested XX, is low. So, my situation is, I believe I've taken the pill, and I believe, the probability of R, given that I've taken XX, that's low. Well, what do we say about this scenario? Is this, what's going on here? It seems that I have a defeater for all my beliefs. Now, notice that since I have a defeater for all my beliefs, I also have a defeater for my belief that I have taken the XX pill. So I no longer have any justification for believing that I've taken the XX pill. But does this get me off the hook? I mean, does this allow me to become confident about my reliability again? Well, it's not clear how, right? Like the mere fact that I've lost my justification for believing that I have taken XX, that does not mean that I now again have justification for believing that my faculties are reliable. I mean, as long as I do believe that I've taken XX, regardless of whether that belief is justified, it looks like I have a defeater for all my other beliefs. I mean, consider what you would conclude if you actually took the pill, right? I mean, of course, there's nothing to stop you from just forming the belief that you didn't take the pill. But if you seem to remember taking the pill, you have a problem. And that problem doesn't go away merely because the belief that you took the pill is defeated. Indeed, what happens, it seems, is that after I take the pill, I end up in a kind of loop. So I take the pill, I form the belief, I have taken the XX pill, and I take it, I have good reason for this belief. You know, I've got a memory of taking the pill, other people testify that they saw me take the pill, whatever. This gives me a defeater for all my beliefs, including the belief that I have taken the XX pill. Since I have a defeater for the belief that I've taken the XX pill, I might think that I can trust my faculties again. But that just puts me back in the original position, where I have good reason to believe that I've taken the XX pill, because I remember taking it, other people testified that I took it, etc. So I have good reason to believe that I've taken the XX pill, a good reason to believe that the pill destroys cognitive reliability of 95% of those who take it, etc. So I have a defeater for all my beliefs, and on it goes in a sort of loop. The same problem occurs in the context of the evolutionary argument, right? So I come to believe the evolutionary story. I see that this provides a defeater for all my beliefs. I see that this claim is a defeater for itself. So I doubt the evolutionary story. So I have no defeater for all my beliefs. But you know what happens then is I start trusting my cognitive faculties again. But as soon as I trust my cognitive faculties again, I assess the evidence for the evolutionary story, see that it's overwhelming, and then I just go back to believing the evolutionary story, and I get a defeater for all my beliefs again, and around it goes. By seeing that the defeater defeats itself, I land back in my original condition, which then just gives me a defeater for all my beliefs again. It's also worth noting, I suppose, that, you know, with respect to self-defeat in the evolutionary case, it's sort of like not really enough to point out that the argument is self-defeating, because so the argument is going to say, well, if you accept the evolutionary story, you have no reason to believe that your beliefs are reliable. The trouble is we have overwhelming evidence that human beings evolved through natural selection. The modern evolutionary synthesis is one of our best theories. Now, obviously, one way to resist the skeptical argument would be to deny evolutionary theory, but that's not an appealing path. So the evolutionary debunker will say, this is analogous to the XX pill case, right? If I take the pill, and I clearly remember taking the pill, I have good reason to believe that I've taken the pill, and I get the defeater for all my beliefs. Analogously, given the strength of the evidence for the modern evolutionary synthesis, I have good reason to believe the modern evolutionary synthesis. I accept this origin story for humanity. And then the debunker says, well, that gives you a defeater for all your beliefs. Whether the argument is self-defeating, I mean, maybe it is self-defeating in the sense that it's a global debunking argument, right? It's aiming to provide a defeater for all beliefs. So in some sense, we shouldn't be surprised if global debunking arguments are self-defeating. If the argument is successful, then of course it's going to defeat itself. It aims to defeat everything. So yes, it's going to apply to itself. But it's not clear that in this particular case, self-defeat reduces the skeptical force of the argument. Or that might be one way to that the debunker can defend themselves against this charge. Okay, so far we have been considering an evolutionary debunking argument. But global debunking arguments might appeal to different accounts of the origin of our belief-forming processes. So we saw that the evolutionary debunking argument has been used by Plantinga to attack naturalism specifically. One of the standard responses to Plantinga on this point is that a similar argument can be made against the theist. So Plantinga is a theist. His purpose in giving the evolutionary debunking argument was to defend theism, right? So he wanted to show, look, if you accept naturalism and you accept the evolutionary story, you end up with this global skepticism. But that's just unacceptable, right? So, we obviously, given the overwhelming evidence for the evolutionary story, we don't want to drop that part of it, so we should drop the naturalism. We should believe in God. That's basically Plantinga's line. But the objection has been raised that a similar debunking argument can be made against the theist. Okay, so suppose that our belief-forming processes have been shaped by God. It need not be that God literally made humans with the snap of her fingers. Maybe the story is true, but it was in some way directed by God. The evolutionary story, that is. Maybe that story is true, but it was, shaped in some way by God. The point is, God plays some role in the creation of human beings. Now, what is the probability that our belief-forming processes are reliable under the assumption that theism is true, that God exists? If there is a God, would she have ensured that our cognitive faculties are reliable? Well, many theists take it that God probably would do this. A perfect being would not be a deceiver, as Descartes said. God made man in her own image, and since God has perfect knowledge, she would presumably make man with imperfect knowledge. So, initially at least, we might think it probable that God would create us with reliable faculties. But there are two assumptions at play here. The first assumption is that false belief is bad. It's not obvious that this is so. Presumably this is going to depend on our account of what human well-being consists in. But if you take, for instance, hedonistic accounts of well-being, there isn't anything problematic about false beliefs in themselves. I recently uploaded a video on the swamping problem, where I discussed how it's not obvious that true beliefs are preferable to false beliefs. I'll link that in the comments. But second, let's suppose that false beliefs are bad. Well, we also have to assume, if we're going to say that it's probable that God would create us with reliable faculties, we also have to assume that the disvalue of false belief is not outweighed by other goods that might be gained by having false beliefs. We've already noted that false beliefs can promote survival and reproduction, and presumably the theist thinks that survival and reproduction are good. So, that's one example of how false belief might lead to other goods, and maybe there are, various other benefits that are gained from holding systematically false belief. So, with that in mind, we have to take seriously the probability that God has good reason for creating us with unreliable faculties. Notice that we can treat this as a special case of the problem of evil. There are many evils in the world. There's genocide, cancer, slavery, natural disasters. Theists do not take the existence of these evils to refute the existence of God. But then it might be that among the evils in the world is the evil of systematically unreliable cognitive faculties. One popular response to the problem of evil is skeptical theism. The skeptical theist claims that the existence of seemingly pointless evils does not refute the existence of God, because for all we know, God has good reason for permitting that evil. The evil isn't actually pointless. And, we can motivate this because, look, we do not know all of the goods and evils of the world. We do not know the detailed connections between the goods and evils. Maybe some seemingly pointless evil actually serves a greater purpose that we are not aware of. The mere fact that we are unable to come up with a good reason for permitting various evils does not indicate that God has no reason for permitting those evils. God knows far more than we do and has access to far more information, so it wouldn't be surprising if she has reasons for permitting evils where we are unable to comprehend those reasons. Well, along the same lines, there might be some great good, somehow achieved by us having thoroughly unreliable faculties. This would give God good reason to create us with unreliable faculties. The mere fact that we are unable to come up with a good reason for this does not indicate that God has no good reason for this. And bear in mind that we all agree that our faculties are unreliable in some respects. People are subject to all sorts of biases and illusions and so on. I mean, it's difficult to see why God made us this way, but if God exists, then she had good reason to make us this way. But then how can we be sure that she didn't also have good reason to permit wholesale unreliability? So let's just stipulate that what God ultimately cares about is what is objectively good for us. With that in mind, we might make this sort of argument. Premise 1, our belief-forming processes have been shaped by God. Premise 2, so our belief-forming processes have been chosen to promote what is objectively good for us. Premise 3, false beliefs can be as useful for promoting what is good as true beliefs. Premise 4, so belief-forming processes shaped by God are not truth-tracking. Conclusion, we are unjustified in believing that our belief-forming processes are reliable. So there we have, a very different origin story, but again, we can forward this claim of unreliability, or at least we have no reason to trust the sources of our beliefs. Okay, that is the global debunking argument. And that's all I have to say for this video. I hope you found that interesting. See you all next time.